You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everybody, we're back. Welcome to Where No BUBS Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this podcast for my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're recording all of these shows and putting them out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm good. We're reviewing Contagion, which debuted on March 20th, 1989. This is Season 2, Episode 11. And this is actually, I think, one of the better episodes of the season. I enjoy it a lot just because it's a very tight narrative that really never loses control of itself. And despite some of the more fantastical elements in this episode, it really is classic Star Trek in terms of just having a very kind of nuts and bolts story with a lot of cool different alien races going to different worlds, and there's a great big mystery involved. And I think in many ways this is kind of the building blocks to what makes a successful Star Trek episode.
Yeah.
So what do you think of Contagion?
I think it's very tight also. I was just looking at my notes, and I think really the key kind of new science fiction that's introduced, it has all the elements you've said of stellar archaeology, aliens with the Romulans. But then the most important thing it brings up is the whole idea of stargates, wormholes,
Right.
Folds in space and time, and so forth. Because that's important, because that comes up a lot in future episodes of Next Generation and other Star Trek franchises as well.
Well, it's important that you brought up archaeology, because in two ways archaeology shows up in this episode in very distinct manners. First one is we learn that Jean-Luc Picard has a long abiding interest in archaeology, even to the point where later on we learn that he almost considered it as a possible career versus being a starship captain.
Right.
The second point is, you're right, archaeology plays a huge part in this story, and it's really one of the first stories in Star Trek, The Next Generation, where we really do have a story that builds on the idea that there really was a larger, more successful civilization at one point in the galaxy that we actually know about because of archaeology,
Mm-hmm.
and we're still kind of stuck having to unravel the mystery of it. I like these science fiction stories just because, in some ways, it does away with the idea of the centrality of humans in the universe, because it's not just about us. If you believe in something called, well, it's not really something you believe in. It's science. But if you understand something called the Drake equation, which is a probabilistic argument used to estimate the number of active communicative extraterrestrial civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy. The idea that somehow one day, if we go out to the stars and we don't find worlds that are full of dead civilizations that have long gone before us, it will actually be very surprising.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Star Trek is actually, for me, one of the first places where it kind of introduced the idea that our history is not unique to us, but part of a greater intergalactic story.
And the thing I was thinking about just when they're writing uh, the series and the episodes and so forth, they really did a lot of work, and they must have had a lot of really good, scientific consultants and people, that were really into extraterrestrial intelligence and UFOs and so forth. Because one of the lines that Picard uses at one point is refers to the technology the Iconians had, that if they could appear out of the thin air on distant planets, that they're like the demons of air and darkness, which is which
Right.
is a which is a term that the UFO community uses actually. So
Correct.
I was actually thinking, who did they borrow that line from?
Well, there's kind of an aside. You've been reading a lot about UFOs recently, and we've been having a lot of discussions here on where no Bubs has gone before, and also offline about the recent report that came out from the government about UFOs or UAPs,
Right,
unidentified aerial. What's UAP again? Un-
unidentified aerial phenomenon.
right, phenomenon. Um, I think when it comes to Star Trek and where it hits and where the writers come from, there's a lot of cross section between um, the hard science in terms of people that actually came from the scientific community, especially aerospace, and a lot of people who come from the social sciences, especially law. There's a lot of cross section with that, but there's also a lot of wonky science fiction too. And I think the beauty of this episode is that it kind of walks the line between the two here in
Hmm.
Contagion,
Hmm.
where on one hand it does play with some ideas that are scientifically plausible, but the way they use it is purely fantastical. For example, like the wormholes, and we've mentioned in previous episodes other shows that use wormhole technology as the basis of the story, primarily Stargate. Um, you know, Before we dig into the actual episode itself, let's talk about wormhole technology. As a sci-fi fan, have you ever had a general opinion on the kind of stories that are told with wormhole technology, and do you have a general opinion on wormholes themselves as a storytelling device, or maybe as a just a thought in general? Because we know they actually exist in our universe.
I haven't studied the science, so I can't, the statement you just made that we know they exist, I can't, support that or, discuss that and say, oh, yeah, that's true. But I think, the whole concept, I remember, trying to study, Einstein and how, space, particularly, gravity can affect how space is formed, and then
Hmm.
time factors into that. I think that if you can bend space, just through gravity, then that opens up the possibility that can you bend, just like you take a piece of paper, as the model goes with a wormhole, and take the ends of it and bend it to the point so that the ends that are when the piece of paper is flat is far apart, that those pieces all of a sudden touch, and then they're a very short distance. So, the theory of it, I honestly don't understand it as well as I would like. But,
No, you actually got it pretty close. The
but,
actual wormhole theory.
I think that and like you said, I've been reading a lot about UFOs and what they might mean, and some of the descriptions are, well, they're transdimensional. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that maybe they come from other star systems, and the way that they deal with traveling uh, light years is that they do have wormholes. They've identified wormholes, um, and then that gets into the question of are some of these UAPs are really intelligent entities, what time do they really come from? Are they from the
Hmm.
future? Are they from the past? A lot of times
Well,
there's talk about that the extraterrestrials might be from the future, but what about the possibility that they're from the past also?
what
Never
if the
thought of that.
well, the possibility exists that they're not even from our current dimension.
That's true also. Yes,
Like,
that's true also.
one thing that quantum physics has pushed forward as something that's generally accepted as plausible among the physics community is the theory of the multiverse.
Yes, right.
So, if these aliens have the ability to punch a wormhole in space time, because what we're talking about when we talk about interstellar travel often is dealing with space time. Um, if they have the ability to punch a hole in space time and travel from one dimension to another, that it's interesting because it brings up one of my favorite sci-fi shows called Sliders. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
John Rhys Davies stars in it along with Jerry O'Connell and some other really great talent that I can't remember. But it was a show in the '90s where essentially they hopped from from multiple universes using this kind of control that would allow them to slide through a wormhole. And on these multiple universes, there was actually this other race of aliens that had actually started taking over the multiverse, called the Chronons, I think, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It gets into the idea that if aliens could visit us from alternate dimensions and they had the means of traveling that way, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've actually successfully mastered space travel. They've
Mm-hmm.
mastered interdimensional travel,
Right.
which is far different because what we're talking about usually when we're talking about space travel is distance, getting
Right.
from point A to point B. What
Exactly.
these interdimensional aliens are probably dealing with, if they are truly interdimensional beings that have mastered interdimensional travel, they're not talking about getting from point A to point B. They're talking about getting from universe A47 Alpha 6 to universe M35 Jetta 2.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's a very different conversation we're having in terms of travel, where the idea of warp or light speed or even slip space kind of falls out of the conversation because we're now dealing with something that is existentially so difficult that even quantum theorists have a hard time with it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of the trick of quantum physics and quantum theory as well. Like, a lot of it's very hard to pin down, especially now with the discovery of muons after the recent experiments with the Hadron Collider,
Mm-hmm.
which really complicate things. So for those at home, like, don't take my word for this, but this is just from the scant reading I've done, and because the information we have really is scant, since we've discovered these kind of the next layer of the atom, essentially, right? Subatomic to subatomic.
Right.
Um, Muons have the potential that we can actually interact with them with our thoughts. We
Mm-hmm.
knew in quantum physics already that there was the possibility of quantum entanglement, which actually posits of many things. Quantum entanglement posits many, many things, but one of the things it posits is that we actually have the ability to make changes and decisions to our actual material universe. I'm not talking about actually, like, I'm not saying if I could summon a stone. Like, if I wanted to say, oh, I want to summon a cloud of dirt right here in front of my face, I don't
Mm-hmm.
suddenly just magically, generate dirt. I don't make something from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But possibly I can send out some sort of energy or some sort of resonance or frequency that creates some sort of small change in the universe. And this kind of gets into some new age theories and philosophies about, the hippies used to have this idea that if we all just raised our frequencies that we could end things like violence and war and, greed and all this stuff. And this discovery of the muon is not saying that that's possible, But what it is saying, however, is that we may have a little bit more ability to exert change on our universe than we originally thought. It may be down at the subatomic, even below that, a minuscule level, but what this muon means is something very revolutionary. I think and this, people, I'm a fantasy author, so don't take this. This is all from what I've been reading, and I've been reading this for a bit. Um, so, I think what particle physicists, astrophysicists, quantum physicists, I think in physics, there's a general focus on trying to achieve a theory of everything. This is a little bit what string theory was trying to achieve, and a very famous string theorist is Michio Kaku. And Michio Kaku really thinks that Einstein couldn't even figure out string theory, so he kind of left it for other people to figure out, which is what Newton did too. Newton came up with the law of gravity, but he couldn't actually explain how gravity worked. Einstein later figured out through the laws of relativity how gravity worked in space time, which is what we're talking about here. Um, String theorists had the idea that if you figured out string theory, you kind of figured out the equation to everything,
Mm-hmm.
but that hasn't panned out yet because string theory hasn't been able to replicate some of its claims.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which when it comes to quantum theory and quantum physics, that's hard to do as it is to begin with. Um, But in general, we're trying to reach this idea of a theory of everything. I think because once we reach a theory of everything, some of the things that we see in Star Trek may actually become plausible, like transporters. If we could actually dematerialize ourselves down to the atoms and then somehow reconstruct ourselves in a different place and really move our atoms from point A to point B, that's possible if you have a theory of everything. If you want something like protein synthesis in terms of food replicator, that becomes much more possible with a theory of everything. If you really want to probably figure out a warp drive, you really do need a theory of everything to break down, and again, I've been giving a lot of thought to this, and I'm just a fantasy author. But I have this plan for writing a sci-fi series one day, and one of the things they have in there is kind of different ideas of how to achieve warp travel. My story features no human races. This is all aliens. But they all have different ideas of how to achieve warp travel, and all these different warp engines have different effects on the universe when they use them. But one thing that I was thinking about, because I read a lot about cosmology in terms of how space time works and just the general material of space itself that you would have to travel through. It's not a question of just figuring out what's your destination on your XY axis. It's also figuring out, like, okay, when are you going to stop? Because there's no inertia out. There's nothing out there to actually stop you. One thing that Star Trek posits is that if you generate this warp field, somehow you're going to be able to control the subspace field that is naturally there in space, so you'll be able to break yourself somehow using subspace.
Well, I thought
That,
about that even when they're in warp drive and a situation comes up, Picard
right.
says, full stop. And Wesley
Mm-hmm.
Crusher says, aye, aye, sir, full stop. And, in 7 seconds, the Enterprise is going not at warp speed, but it's on impulse, and it just
Right.
grinds to a stop. And it's like,
How
how
does
did they
everyone
do
not
that?
fling forward?
What's the braking mechanism here? Exactly.
So one thing that the show Enterprise did, and I think it was a good thing that they wrote this into the canon. Um, One thing that Tucker had to deal with a lot was the deflector dish in front of
Mm-hmm.
the NX-01, because the NX-01's deflector dish is the thing that was actually creating the warp shell that they needed to travel. But I think that warp shell also moves certain particles in space out
Sure.
of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, it did.
But kind of getting back to like my general problem that I'm figuring out in terms of the theory of everything. You know, we keep having this question about what dark matter is in space, and I think until we really figure out what dark matter is, we're not going to figure out how to travel at interstellar speeds necessary to visit distant worlds and planets, let alone visit other galaxies in our known universe beyond the Milky Way. Um, I think figuring out the nature of dark matter really is the key to figuring out how to, even if it comes to interdimensional travel. I think if those aliens have some sort of interdimensional technology, I bet you it interacts with dark matter in some way. Um,
Hmm.
it seems that dark matter is the real riddle here when it comes to figuring out the actual material or pneuma of the universe, so to speak.
Hmm.
I think once we figure that out, and that's probably tied into physicists figuring out this theory of everything. I think once we figure everything down to the most minute, whatever's at the very, 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 very center of the atom, whatever that is, if we can find it, I think that's when you discuss. By that point, we will have a theory of everything. And Michio Kaku says, string theory should be written on one line. That might be human hubris. One thing that, and again, fantasy author, not a physicist. Um, and I've tried to do some reading into this recently, but this idea of having one theory for everything, I think might be, real human hubris. Because if we meet these aliens, and let's say they figured transdimensional travel, or let's say they figured out some sort of space travel where they can actually travel at warp, or they can open a wormhole to actually get from point A to point B, I think that they will probably not have one theory of everything or one equation to do it, but they will have a series of equations to do it.
Hmm.
And I think that one thing that sci fi has probably pushed us into believing is that there is just one equation to make all of this work. I bet you if we meet aliens, they will actually, like I just said, they will have multiple equations to do what they do. And that's where we will get tied up. Because if they have interdimensional travel, they have broken our physics, essentially, in ways that we can't even comprehend yet.
They have a different physics.
Oh, entirely. They
Yeah.
have something that goes far beyond. Um, well, getting into the episode, let's talk about the Iconians.
Sure.
If I may, can I
Go
intro the
ahead.
episode for the audience because we've kind of been talking nebulously
Yeah,
for a
sure. Go
bit.
ahead.
So in this great episode of Star Trek, the USS Enterprise responds to an urgent call from Captain Donald Varley, an old friend of Captain Picard, who, when I went and looked him up, he's actually best friends with Captain Picard from the Academy days. We'll get there. Anyway, Varley's ship, the USS Amato, is the sister ship to the Enterprise and is also a Galaxy class. This ship has been plagued by a series of system malfunctions while in the Romulan neutral zone. While rendezvousing with the Enterprise, Varley explains that he was investigating these rumors about the location of the Iconians and the planet Iconia, which, according to myth and legend, were home to a race of of interstellar interstellar civilizations or civilizations that once ruled the galaxy billions of years before humanity even reached the stars. Or I think it's kind of hinted that before humanity even walked the Earth, that the
Hmm.
Iconians were ruling the
Right.
galaxy.
Right. Yes.
Um, so these malfunctions continue to build along the way, and during the chaos, the Amato's antimatter containment chamber suffers a malfunction, and the ship explodes with all 1,000+ crew members and their families aboard, dead instantly in front of the stunned Enterprise crew. And the very next minute, a Romulan warbird enters the Enterprise sensor range, and that's where we start this really great, really tight, really fast, action-packed story. I think it's one of the quicker ones, but getting into the Iconians for a second. So I think that the idea that we've been talking about when it comes to wormholes is an interesting one because I'm a big fan of Stargate. And I always thought the genius of Stargate and the Goa'uld, which are the enemy race of they're these parasitic beings in the Stargate universe that are the general enemies of humanity and the Asgardian alien race that later allies with humanity to fight them. I always thought that there's a real waste in having large fleets of ships having to patrol large tracts of space, especially if you consider like how space is actually set up. We think in a very two-dimensional manner here
Hmm.
on Earth because in many ways, even though we live in a three-dimensional space, we do travel in two-dimensional ways.
Sure.
You know, planes don't suddenly travel through the Earth. Just they have to go over a flat ocean, flat lands, even though they're not flat. I know,
Right.
um,
Yes.
but space itself is so infinite that the actual idea of sending fleets out is probably more hazardous and wasteful than finding a way to develop a technology where you can literally step from point A to point B in an instant. And wormhole technology in sci-fi allows a lot of races and a lot of great storytelling to do that, and really takes a lot of the onus off the writer in terms of having to come up with technology or starships or ways for people to travel. In many ways, wormholes are kind of the Deus ex machina of uh, sci-fi. They not only get you into the trouble, but they quickly also get you out of the trouble.
Hmm.
Um, if you watch any Stargate episode, one common storytelling trope that you see them get into when they visit a new world is they come through the gate, and usually the thing that they're having to do on their way out is try to stop someone from destroying the gate. Uh,
Hmm.
Gate technology, I think, if it were possible and plausible in our universe, actually offers more opportunity for space travel and exploration than having an actual interstellar fleet ever would. However, there's a problem with Stargate technology or wormhole technology. Can you identify what it is?
Go ahead. Not thinking of it.
If I want to get from Chicago to Baghdad, what do I need?
You need a portal on each side.
Exactly. So, one of the problems with, I think, the Ionian technology that doesn't get explained in the show is how do they actually generate their wormholes or their portals in different places, including the bridge of the Enterprise, which I think they're able to do so because of the Enterprise's proximity to the actual planet. But one thing that you would have to do if you had a Stargate or a wormhole is that you would have to actually construct the beginning point and the end point in space. And in that case, you would actually still have to have ships, maybe even a fleet of them, to actually go and construct these points in space to allow such egress to occur.
Hmm.
Um, I think the Iconians, as they're presented here, I think the Demons in Air and Darkness is a very cool allusion to other mythologies of the past and just kind of the is it Alfred C. Clarke who said that any technology advanced enough seems like magic to us? Or am I
Arthur
thinking
C.
about
Clarke. I,
yeah, Arthur? Was it him or Heinlein that said that?
I'm not sure which one, but yeah,
I think it was Arthur C. Clarke that said that.
one of them said it. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Heinlein would say something about Vietnam, and then
Right.
Um, but I think the interesting thing about the Iconians is that you know clearly 200 years ago they had this. capability to go out and travel to different places without ships. Despite that, their civilization still fails. And it's even speculated by the crew when they're dealing with this that the technological advantages the Iconians had still did not stop them from being
Right.
defeated or possibly wiped out by their enemies. Um, I was wondering if you had any actual reflections on that and what you thought of the Iconian technology as it plays into this episode.
I have a note about that. Let's see. Um, yeah, that was really a sort of a conundrum, an unanswered question, because at one point Picard says the victors write the history,
Right,
and um, in some fear that they do not understand that, and may have been a reason for those who were conquered by the Iconians destroyed them. So it's kind of like if the Iconians were conflict, or they were imperialist in a sense, did something they did end up people, cultures that they perhaps subjugated, did they finally find a way to you know strike back against them, declare freedom or something, destroy their civilization, their culture? And then that gets into, well, if the Iconians were the ones that developed this ability to travel through wormholes or stargates, and as you said, that's how they actually explore their part of the galaxy and so forth. Did that technology come back and was used against them somehow? Because it's like you say, you have to have a portal for a stargate or a wormhole. You have to have a beginning point and an end point.
right.
And the idea that you can go through it in either direction.
Well, the interesting thing about the Iconian technology is that they are able to generate the endpoint without actually having to set up a piece of technology someplace else. Worf is able to take Daya's deactivated body from the Iconian battle room, as I'm calling it, or
Right.
the
Direct
computer center,
directly back to
um,
the Enterprise bridge. Yeah.
directly back. But the interesting thing is, like, when you see him walk through, in the control room, we see him walk through this kind of purplish doorway. So
Uh-huh.
we see him walk through on that side, but if you're on the Enterprise side, he literally just appears.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one thing that I have to wonder about the Iconians, um, to bring up your question about how they were possibly defeated, I think the difficult thing about the victors writing the history is that the victors often get their own history wrong, and we're always reinterpreting the victors in ways that the victors never expected us to. It's kind of the Ozymandias story, in a way, where I think it's a famous God, it's someone's famous poem. But basically, someone goes out into the desert and finds this monument to this great leader named Ozymandias, who said, "Look upon my kingdom in despair, because it will be
Sure.
everlasting." When
Right.
the truth is, like, nothing's everlasting. Uh, um, I think what most likely could have happened to the Iconians is that the reason we have the story of the Iconians in the first place is that just like we have the story of Rome, there was I think the enemy that probably brought down the Iconians were the Iconians themselves. Rome was brought down through by internal struggles before it ever met um, any outside interference that actually brought it down. In fact, there were several outside forces that tried to defeat Rome, especially in the east, that were unsuccessful. It was really Rome's internal struggle in politics that ultimately ended the empire.
Hmm.
I probably think that the reason why we have the story of the Iconians is that the survivors of the Iconian Empire's fall are probably the same people that brought it down. And it's one of those weird things where, like, early medieval history has a lot of European kingdoms trying to establish themselves as the immediate successor of Rome. Charlemagne did this by
Sure,
declaring himself Holy Roman Emperor.
sure.
You know, there really was a fixation on being able to say, we're the continuation of Caesar, or the continuation of Augustus or Octavian.
Right, and what the word czar means and what the word Kaiser means.
Exactly. Like, everyone has kept a lot of Roman history in their culture when they really didn't need to, if you think about it.
No,
Like,
they
they
didn't.
could have created something native to themselves, but
Sure.
Rome is such a powerful cultural institution, even with our own human history, that we harken back to it without even thinking about it sometimes. We even still to this day, and not only like Roman culture, but Greek culture, there's a reason why we call certain soldiers Spartans and we celebrate Spartan culture. It's because that a certain part of Greek culture was so influential upon the world at one point.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's entered our modern lexicon, much
Right.
like Rome has. I think the victors who beat the Iconians are probably the Iconians themselves, or who was ever left of the breakup empires afterwards. Or um, Alexander the Great wasn't actually beaten by an army; he just stretched himself too far, and he was beaten by a disease.
Exactly.
This is
Yes.
this is also a story that we see actually kind of fleshed out in the recent Man of Steel movie by Zack Snyder about why Krypton actually failed. Krypton failed because they stretched their resources in their own home planet out too thinly, and they
Hmm.
reached too far into the galaxy that they wasted all of their resources. We never really explored where the Iconians get their infinite power. We just know that they have an infinite power source. But I think the secret to that is that there may be no such thing as an infinite power source. We may be able to contain something that's infinite, but
Hmm.
you still have to create a dilithium chamber to have a warp drive. You still
Right.
have to
Right.
have a ship to hold the warp drive and to actually propel something to go forward. All of these material things break down.
Right.
Um, I think what we're seeing in this episode is like whoever beat the Iconians abandoned all of this technology, and that's where I think kind of this idea of the victors who wrote the story of the Iconia were probably the Iconians themselves.
Hmm.
They probably looked internally and saw like, oh, we have this technology we're using, and we have to stop. And they probably brought down the empire and then broke up that way
Hmm.
200,000 years ago. Um, but beyond that speculation, um, one thing that I think happens in the episode that's very strange to start with is that Varley enters the neutral zone in search of Iconia, and throughout this series, The Next Generation, going to the neutral zone seems to be a no-no in general. I'm surprised that they're only sending the Enterprise in to rescue Varley, and that they even allowed there's only other Galaxy class ship, the sister ship of the Enterprise, to take on such a risky mission. I understand Varley's concern about Romulans getting their hands on Iconian technology, as he should be, because this technology is truly scary.
Hmm.
Um, but the general setup for the episode kind of doesn't make sense to me.
Hmm.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on it.
Well, let's see. What are my notes here? I think it's sort of it's the whole thing. I mean, Varley kind of made a command decision. Makes me think, did he actually have the approval of Starfleet to go into the neutral zone, because you're not supposed to go into the neutral zone unless there's a threat.
Right.
So did he get Starfleet approval, or did he do that on his own?
How far
And
does Captain's prerogative really go in the
that's
Federation?
that's it. Um, and obviously the Romulans watched the neutral zone. That's why they entered and so on. And that kind of gets into one question back to the Iconians. What I guess there was Iconian technology left
Hmm.
in terms of the probe and so forth, because that was the software that was downloaded and so forth was what caused the Yamato to have problems, and ultimately was going to have create the destruction of the Enterprise, and it was going to destroy the Romulan vessel also.
So to explain to everyone at home what we're talking about, when when the Yamato comes near the planet of Iconia or the dead planet of Iconia, the defensive network still existing on the planet launches this probe that interacts with any ship that approaches, and essentially the probe uploads software to whatever ship that approaches and overwrites that ship's um, computer programming that's already there and takes over. And usually, because of this incompatibility between the two technologies, probably due to the hundreds of thousands of years between them, usually ships blow up because of this, because so many errors begin to occur. Um, but continue on with your point. Sorry, I just wanted to explain that to the audience.
Well, I think, I just kind of finished my thought, which is, kind of straying from at the same time. This was in 1989. Computers were still relatively new,
Right.
particularly to the general public. So I think it was very interesting that how the problem ended up getting solved. And, since they found that the malware, to use that term, was just in a certain sector of the computer. So if
Right.
they just basically rebooted the computer, they could rid themselves and save the Enterprise, and they shared that information with the Romulan ship. And the thing that really pointed that out was when Data was damaged, and they thought that he was actually dead.
Yeah, they
His
have a very sincere scene
Yeah,
about
I
his
mean,
death.
what was happening in his core memory was just rebooting. And
Yeah,
it's like, oh yeah, I do this all the time. People do this all the time when their computer goes wacky. They just say, well, shut the damn thing down and reboot it, and a lot of times that'll fix it.
I, I think one thing that it's interesting that you bring up this being written in 1989, kind of where computer technology was at the moment. Most people think today that hacking is this very complicated thing that takes place between um, high level computer engineers in different countries, but truthfully, hacking can be a very low tech criminal endeavor that involves someone just stealing your email and finding your password. Um, I think the I think the interesting idea of the tech, the software the Iconians send up overriding the system, and then you can just kind of reboot from it is is an interesting notion built on this idea that somehow we in the future have figured out a way to, I guess, restart systems from a fresh static state, which doesn't make sense to me in this case because the Enterprise has backups upon backups and redundancies to keep it going. Even Geordi says at one point, much of the ship is run off of artificial intelligence.
Yes, I noted that.
E-
Right.
even if you even if you reboot the ship, I would have to imagine that something from the Iconian software remains. Even if they boot it to an earlier point before the actual mission itself starts. Um, at the same time, I don't understand why the Iconian software comes in and overwrites everyone's system, because they've. It just seems to me there's smarter ways to deal with it. Um,
Well,
in general, like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
maybe this gets that to the point, like I said, when they're writing these stories, they had to, bring in some consultants, just not
Right.
science fiction angle, but a technical angle related relative to computers. And maybe they just didn't, spend that much, put that much energy into looking at it from a computer system standpoint. They simplified, the process there.
Well, I think there's also a little bit, and including the scene, there's a little bit of tongue in cheek to the entire process of Data waking up and saying,
Yes, that's
"Oh, all
true.
we have to do is reboot him."
Yeah.
Uh, Often, I think one of the key lessons that Star Wars tries to teach. I'm sorry, Star Trek. It's late, folks. That's Star Wars. Shit, I'm gonna get crap for that. One of the key lessons I think Star Trek tries to teach us in the storytelling often is that the crew tries to solve these very complex problems in intricate ways because that's what they're trained to do in novel situations. They have this system that they go through that all military organizations have. They have a list of protocols in terms of how you're supposed to behave and react in certain situations. But often in these novel situations, they find themselves. Usually, the answer the writers provide is the crew needs to do something simple to get out of it. Like, they just need to reboot the computer,
Hmm.
or they just need to let the energy scan them, or they just need to go push through the wormhole. It's always something very simple, and I think the writers are kind of intentionally trying to do that to remind us that sometimes the our biggest obstacle when we face these kind of challenges is ourselves. And I think this episode's very illustrative of kind of that interplay that the Star Trek writers have in terms of kind of minimizing us down to what we're probably going to deal with in space, and then at the same time bouncing us back up with kind of this ludicrous solution to a real problem. Because one thing that I think we will face if we journey out to the galaxy, and I mentioned previously, what if we run into dead civilizations? What if we run into dead civilizations that do have technology like that? And we do have something like an intergalactic internet that suddenly gets infected with a virus that's 300 or 400,000 years old that we have no way of understanding. It
Well,
could cripple.
one of the themes that you're bringing up is that there's there used to be a cartoon strip called Pogo, and Walt Kelly was the name of the cartoonist. I just looked him up, and one of the most
Huh.
memorable lines from Pogo was, uh, "We has met the enemy, and they is us."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I think going into space, the greatest foe that we are always going to be going up against is our own sense of fear of the unknown. And when we don't understand something, we kind of end up like Riker, kind of in this what the fuck state. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
And the truth is, the Enterprise gets really lucky at the end of this episode in terms of Picard through Data kind of figuring out how to solve this. If Picard wasn't there and Picard wasn't able to keep control not only of the situation but himself,
Right.
everyone, including the Romulans, would have been screwed.
Right.
And it really is kind of like the skin of his teeth, seat of his pants, last moment that he gets to do this.
Yes.
But the most likely outcome, if this was real life and we were sending astronauts up to like deal with this, those astronauts are probably dead. Um, I think one thing that I appreciate in this episode, kind of jumping off, the actual fear of what we face in space. one thing that I think is very realistic to maybe what we have to do in the future is Jean-Luc Picard's behavior in this. He watches his best friend, Donald Varley, and his sister ship explode in front of him
Right.
and has to take immediate command not only to prevent a piece of technology falling into Romulan hands, but also kind of prevent the return of the Iconian technology to the universe.
Right.
And he not only sees Varley die, he potentially sees Data die, which, the writers of Star Trek have a very interesting plot point sometimes where they kill Data for a piece of humor. Like, he wakes up and he doesn't know what's been going on, but he still wants to help. I
Mm-hmm.
get it, and it's done cutely here, but it's another one of those tongue-in-cheek things that sometimes I think is indicative of the series that maybe takes away from the moment and the impact of the story.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the steadiness of Jean-Luc Picard here in terms of the things that the crew has to face, and even the steadiness of Riker, even though Riker's reaction is "What the fuck? What do I do?" Um, I think it's a key point here to point out that even if humans, even if the humans of humanity is humanity itself, I've met the enemy is us. Uh, I think the answer that Star Trek also provides is that there will always be one day we will have the ability to face these huge monumental challenges with our abilities and our gumption alone. And you'll have people like Jean-Luc Picard and Will Riker and Worf and Geordi and Data and Troy and the entire crew there to and Pulaski, she's there.
Well, I was just thinking on a much smaller scale what happened on Apollo 13, where they
Right.
had that pressure tank explode, and those astronauts, they had to come up with, they worked closely with NASA at Mission Control in Houston, but they knew what resources they had, like duct tape and so forth, and bubble gum almost, so that they could jerry rig the ship to survive and get back home.
Well, not to take away from their technical aptitude and some of the miraculous things they used through science to survive that trip, but a lot of what they had to do too was through sheer will and toughness.
Oh,
Like, at one point,
absolutely.
passing through the dark side of the moon and having to sit there and shiver in that capsule through
Yeah.
it, like they all could have died of hypothermia,
Right.
and no one would have known. They would have just drifted off into the silence of space, and no one
Yeah.
would have known.
That's
There
right.
was so much danger to that mission. Um, I think that would be so much more compounded if you had to have suddenly have 1,000 souls facing off against this strange piece of alien tech that no one can understand except Data, who somehow through the magic of android philology reconstructs their root language in 15 minutes.
Oh, yes. Right.
I we've had the conversation before that is used sometimes to do wow, holy shit things, but he really is the Deus Ex Machina of season 2 in many cases.
Right. Yes.
Do you think that that's an improvement on the stories or a flaw to them as we go forward in the season?
I don't think it's either. I just think it brings up things we've talked about before as um, you know um, how important artificial intelligence is becoming now and how important it will become in the future. And then it gets into the philosophical question of at what point do machines become sentient?
Right.
Again, to kind of more specifically answer your question, I don't think it adds or takes away. It's something. It is he is a Deus ex machina in a sense that he becomes very important to the story, to the whole evolving
Right.
history of the Enterprise, the next generation, because there's always his struggle Data's struggle and his friend's struggle is he human? At what point does
Right.
he become human? Is he actually human now, but just, enhancing his humanness from more experiences?
Well, there's also the question of, is he a god embodied? Because he does have certain things, like he has super strength, he has super agility. Um, he, and this is weirdly after we determined his humanity in A Measure of the Man. Um, there are many qualities to Data that are also godlike. He, in some ways, is able to render perfect judgment because of his detachment, due to a lack of emotion. He has this, basically library of information that's always continuing to expand in his head and is always refreshing. In many ways, Data's the ultimate trump card for the crew of the Enterprise, because if they really need something in a pinch, Data will just pull it out of his android ass and get it done. But there is a point, the Deus Ex Machina is a classic Greek theater trope
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
something coming into the play at the last moment and
Sure.
inalterably fixing the story. Everyone tries to. Usually in the play, they would attribute it to like a god or
Yes.
spirits or some sort of phenomena just coming
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
and helping the protagonist to make something happen in the story. I think the difference here is that in many ways, Data is. If we take Data merely on the things we see him do, he has his program overwritten in this episode, and by all means, he dies. And then magically, he resurrects himself. Does this mean that, like, even in the face of 200-year-old advanced alien technology, Data can somehow, like, throw off the quote unquote virus of that technology from his system and literally resurrect from the dead? Like, if you really look at Data, and I know this is a weird tangent I've gone off of, um, if you really look at Data, Data has a lot of godlike attributes that Sung threw in there that I don't think we really ever account in terms of how his unique specialness. Like, yes, the humanity is there, but there is something there that is uniquely different to him because of how he's constructed, how he was conceived, and how he can perform. Um,
That's an interesting point because it confirms, the discussion that he's a sentient being, but then it goes beyond that and says, well, what kind of being is he? Is he actually
mhm,
superhuman?
yes. Well, recently, I don't know if you saw this on Facebook. Dad and I are Facebook friends, everyone, which should not be a shocker. Um, the fantasy about Superman isn't that there's someone with powers, it's that there's someone with powers who's decided to do good. That's the actual fantasy. In many ways, Data is the Superman fantasy. He is a creature from another planet, stuck in a place where he's trying to fit in with the other creatures he sees, but because of his abilities, he's always feeling this sense of separation from them. In many ways, the Superman story is also a God story of,
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, yeah.
and even, Data is a God story because Sung made Data in man's image, Sung's image. Data, even in the image of man, so far outsizes and exceeds the abilities of man. I think we do have to have the conversation that maybe it's not Deus Ex Machina. Maybe Data really is kind of a god character and is able to pull off these things because the writers are like, okay, this we don't really know what this guy can do, so whatever we write for him is maybe not breaking the rules to make something happen. Maybe we're writing the rules as we go.
Mm-hmm.
Because I the reason I'm thinking about this is the end of Picard. Data's immortal. Data's fully immortal, and it isn't until Picard basically pulls out Data's data sticks from the mainframe on, I forget what the planet's called at the end of.
I don't
Picard, but
I
it's
don't
where all the
remember.
Soong androids hang out.
Yeah, right.
Data's still alive until Picard pulls out all of those data sticks, and then we see Data in his constructed afterlife actually die of old age and fade away. Um, Data kind of exceeds a lot of the definitions, or starts to meet a lot of the definitions we tried to apply in determining if Q was a god during the very first episode of this show. Um, do you have any more thoughts on that? I know I've been kind of going on.
No. It's a new idea. I need to think about it more. I'm intrigued
Okay.
by it, but I don't have any additional comments right now.
It doesn't sound like complete bullshit, does it?
No, it doesn't. Because
Well,
particularly
like,
when well, it doesn't because when you talk about data and then you bring, you know, the parallels with the Superman story, and then you bring in Q. It just at what I guess it's a sort of thing where you have a being. At what point are they so advanced? Do they have so much capability that they become what we would define as a god?
well, maybe I should do away with the word god, and maybe we should go back to the mythological term of demigod.
I
A
think that's
creation of the divine.
I
Yeah.
think that's actually a better term. Yes,
Well,
I think that's
because
a better term.
when I said Data can start meeting some of the definitions of a god, like in some ways, he can one day possibly reach omniscience. Just because he seems to have this expanding memory or this ability to learn information that's constantly expanding. So,
Hmm.
in some ways, he could be programmed to be omniscient one day. He can't be everywhere, so he can't be omnipresent. And he
No,
can't just create things out of nothing, so he's not omnipotent. So, maybe demigod really is a better definition.
it probably is. Yes, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
one thing before we go, and I really want to talk about the interplay between Jean-Luc Picard and Will Riker here, because traditionally, it was set up that Will Riker goes on the away missions and Captain Picard stays on the bridge of the Enterprise, and that's how Will Riker likes it because Will wants to take care of the captain. Um,
And
what
that's really following Starfleet regulations as well.
true. But one thing I think is interesting in this episode is they really try to contrast the leadership styles between Will and Jean-Luc Picard. And I find one thing interesting about Will Riker is that Captain Picard isn't very emotional. He's very, very focused, very kind of cold to the situation. He never really raises his voice or gets flustered. Will Riker's a very emotional character, even in the process of leading.
Hmm.
Even in the process of leading, he's able to keep the what the fuck about everything under wraps and under control, except for one thing that you pointed out in your notes that I, th- I think is actually really funny. Um, he has this really nice interplay with Deanna Troy on the bridge when everything's falling apart. The Iconian software is making the Enterprise D bust apart at the seams, essentially. And he looks at Deanna, who's having this real moment where she senses everyone's unease on the ship, and he asks her what to do. I think it's a great scene because it shows how important Deanna is to the actual function of the ship itself.
Yes.
It's it gets back to something I think you said a few episodes ago, the importance of having a Beta Z on the actual crew. You know, if I'm Starfleet, why wouldn't you have one on every ship? Like, I would be recruiting Betazoids left and right
Oh yeah, absolutely.
just to make sure they were staffed everywhere. But
Yeah.
it's a really good scene where, like, they defer to her and show her importance in terms of helping keep things cohesive. But the problem is, like, okay, if they evacuate, where do they go?
That's the comment I made. Like, okay, if the intent of that is, well, should I evacuate the ship to take the crew's mind off of it? Like, well, what's that really? If I was a crew member, they said, well, we're going to evacuate. I would say, okay, to where? You know, so
Well, the
I, I
yeah,
thought that whole plan was kind of weak in a sense, but it was I've got to do something in this case to help hold the crew hold things together, get them to focus on something else. I don't know if they really would have if that would have done it.
I think the obvious problem would have been two things. There's no indication that the pods would actually launch if the Iconian software is causing so many things to malfunction.
Right?
For all you know, for all we know, the crew and the passengers on board could get into the space pods and like lock those people in, and the ship explodes, never having launched one. Uh, the second one is that they're immediately going to be captured by the Romulans if the Romulans can capture them, which doesn't seem like they're going to, because
No,
they're
because
dealing with their
Romulans.
own malfunctions.
Yeah, yeah, right, exactly. Maybe there would be Romulan escape pods mixed in with Starfleet escape pods. Right?
One thing that I would really like to see, maybe in a future Star Trek show or episode, we've never really seen what an escape pod looks like and what really goes into surviving in space once your ship's gone. Like, is this kind of the raft of the Titanic where they're floating out on the frozen ocean? Or is this like, here's a little cabin that you're going to live in for about 3 or 4 days before someone comes and gets you?
The only time you ever see it is in the newer Star Trek movies with Chris Pine and so forth,
Oh, right.
when the Enterprise, or it's not the Enterprise, whatever George um, Kirk, whatever their ship was.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when Kirk's born, and a lot of people escape, and it shows these pods escaping,
Oh, right.
and then you have that in the Stargazer when it was destroyed. A lot of the crew escaped, and they were months in these pods or shuttles or
Right.
something like that. But we never see what the craft are. And then there's one of the later Star Trek new editions where they go down on the planet with Jayla, and they're in these very small pods. But those seem like they would not necessarily be suitable for uh, uh, an escape in interstellar space. That small
Right.
pod was something when you're in orbit around a planet and you're going to survive by getting down on a habitable planet.
Right. And those escape pods were actually used for when the Enterprise was destroyed. So
Yes,
you're
right,
right, they weren't intended for actual like use in space. They
right,
I think the general idea is that if the ship's going down, the crew is going to be abandoning to a planet.
right.
Um, so maybe the idea would have been, if the Enterprise D had exploded and the pods had gotten out, they would have landed on Iconia.
Yeah,
Uh,
perhaps.
unless, the Iconians fired a probe back at them. But anyway, I think that we've covered this episode pretty well for tonight.
I think so.
But before we finish up, once again, what's your general feeling about it? Did you enjoy this episode? Where do you
It
think
was.
it fits in terms of the season? And
I think it's a good story. I'd put it, like you know, on a 1 to 10 scale. I'd give it like a 6, a 6.5.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's a
Yeah,
good episode. It's
it
very
is.
solid, and it
Right.
moves at a very good pace.
It does.
Like
Absolutely.
for a 43 to 45 minute episode, I was very surprised how quickly it went by.
Right. It does. It moves very well. For sure.
Well, everyone, I think that'll be it for tonight. Dad, thank you for joining me for another episode.
Thanks, Jay. It
Um,
was fun.
Absolutely. We'll see each other again for Star Trek Season 2, Episode 12, The Royale. See you later, everyone.
Bye bye. Good night.
Bye bye.